Welcome to our continuing class on positivity bias. We're reviewing the chapters of the book Positivity Bias by Rabbi Mendel Kalmenson. We're discussing practical wisdom of the positive living, and we're up to discussing chapter 6, Limud Zechus, seeking merits and advocating for acceptance and love. And I love this chapter because it's a game changer. It's a total game changer, and it's in retrospect. Now we look back and it's kind of this is the norm, right? The Rebbe has created a norm of how something should be approached, but years ago that was anything but the norm, and it's been a long haul. But without this review back on how things developed, we don't realize the distinction. But the Friedrich Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, he when he was still around, he gathered some of the oldest, more trusted Hasidim, and he said, "We're looking for someone who will seek out the merits of the Jewish people and advocate on their behalf." And that's a huge thing. The idea of not only searching for the good and looking for the good, but actually advocating for that on a very vocal level of things. And that's the bedrock of the Rebbe's whole approach, has been Ahavas Yisrael, an unconditional love and unconditional acceptance of one's fellow. But the idea of Limud Zechus, the term Limud Zechus, Limud means to learn. And so it's the study of finding other person's merits. It's an active it's a verb, it's an active sense. So the Rebbe was constantly looking to see the positive things in people. And we're going to see here, we'll talk about, finding the positive things here in people in their living, right? But in another chapter, we're going to be talking about the Rebbe even did this retroactively.
Let me ask you a quick question. Zechut, is that a Yiddish word?
Hebrew.
It's Hebrew.
Yeah.
Merit. It was okay, but almost everything else in the chapter is like Ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel. So, yeah,
and so this searching for it, and referring back to the chapter we talked about last week, we talked about that comparison about searching for gold or digging in the earth. If you dig shallow, you're only going to find mud and dirt and stones. But if you dig deeper, you might find some real gems. So this is what we're talking about. Limud Zechus, actually searching to find merit, and sometimes in the least likely of places.
Some people used to say that about me in policing. I used to never have a bad word for a fellow police officer. So they used to say, is there anybody that you don't like?
That's a great place to be at.
Well, I was always taught that if you don't have anything good to say, then don't say anything.
Yeah, but I was raised with that too. Implementing that is not easy.
Yeah. As we get into this chapter, it talks about joy, and I always look at joy as humor, and because I get joy out of humor. And even in the worst times, if you can joke, you can function.
Yeah. And that comes from the positivity bias, is being able to find the silver lining in not only any person, but any situation.
So maintain a sense of humor. That's what the police do.
Right. And so he shares a story.
You should be in good shape.
Say again?
As long as you have some nutrition, you probably you don't have to worry about being in total survival mode.
Right. Find the silver lining in whatever the situation. Yeah. There's a fascinating story he shares here about someone who went. We talked last week about going on dollars, going to visit the Rebbe and receiving $1 and a blessing, and then being able to pay to the dollar to redeem that dollar by giving other charity, by the idea of increasing charity. So there's another story about somebody who went to the Rebbe on dollars, and shared a story about someone who was.
That was the businessman, right?
This was the guy who was a grant writer for a federal grant writer.
All right, the grant writer.
And he was getting grants. He was very successful, and then there was this huge decline in his success rate, and it was because somebody happened to be a Jew, which is even more damning. And that person was a cog picking up anything they could find to stop the grant from going through. Why we don't know. But this guy comes to the Rebbe and complains about this other Yid and is making a suggestion that, one of the things that prophets and tzaddikim of old were able to do is remove some of these people in a spiritual realm. And, the first time we talk about that is Moses in Parsha Shemais, in the first book of Exodus, the first chapter of Exodus. There's a story about Moses who he sees somebody hurting a Jew, and he curses him, and the guy dies. So this guy comes to the Rebbe suggesting that this Yid, who is getting in the way of helping all these Jewish foundations getting funding, that the Rebbe should remove a person like this. And the Rebbe's response is so classical, the Rebbe, right? Even if one considers another person to be 90% lacking in goodness and merit, one must nevertheless remember that he maintains 10% of positive virtue. Don't forget the 10%. So there's all this thing negative to say.
Well, I had a big discussion in my Mishnah class today about the Am Haaretz, the simple or the ignoramus, whatever you want to call them, that you're referring to, and the Gemara is not very nice regarding them. You can stab them in the stomach. You can do all kinds of things, And we, is it literal? Is it a spiritual kind of thing? If you put the holes in their stomach, does it let light come through there? So it's really, but the Gemara is not very nice to the simple folk, to not the chaver.
Right, and so that's the example. Is that, and I appreciate you sharing that, because traditionally throughout the centuries, if you were an ignoramus, if you were an idiot, and you prove yourself publicly to be so by doing things like this guy who's getting in the way of funding happening for a Jewish community for no real good reason, just nitpicking to find flaw, right? It's pretty ugly. And the Rebbe literally turned this upside down and said, the 10%.
Yeah, it's interesting that later on in this chapter, they even you can even find merit in the capos in the concentration camps, because of their circumstances. They were doing the best they could. Some of them.
Right. So Limud Zechus.
Some of them.
So that idea of Limud Zechus is trying to study and research to find the good. And so, again, in that stance of the kapos, the Rebbe had basically turned the entire picture around. Especially the author who was interviewing him was focusing on trying to get an understanding of the Rebbe's perspective on such negative people, and the Rebbe refused to even go there. The Rebbe talks about, what do you want from someone in such a circumstance, and uses the author's own book. The Rebbe goes into the author's book, and he shares a different book that the author had written, and says,
auto workers.
Yeah, what about the freedom of auto workers, and shouldn't they revolt? And the guy says, how could they revolt? And that's an environment. And the Rebbe says, and how much more? That's a free environment, and a totalitarian environment, and the Nazi concentration camps and the capos. And what did you want from them? And then, having then found a schus, a merit on that of what could you expect, right? The Rebbe then goes further and he says, the miracle is that there were people who rebelled. Wow. That's amazing. That's astonishing.
Yeah, we know what happened to them.
And they did it, and they still did it.
Right.
That's,
Even though recognizing what the outcome was likely to be. Yeah.
yeah.
I believe there was actually a revolt at Auschwitz. And it didn't work out well, but I'm just saying they did revolt.
Right. And that's the Rebbe's is wants to focus and the light on, wow, how did anyone have the superhuman capacity in that environment to do those kind of things? That's amazing. That's phenomenal. Let's talk about that. So the Rebbe's direction goes to the positive pieces and things. Even the guy there's a story about the guy who comes to shul and he sits and reads a paper in the back of the shul the whole time.
Now that was one of my favorite stories, by the way, because I'm one of those guys that comes to shul and I'll be twiddling around on my iPhone. And I said, that could be me.
And the Rebbe says, look, the guy is so connected. He's so invested that he comes to make sure that there's a minyan. And he clearly, you see, he's not interested in the davening, but he can't not be there. He has to support the minyan and be counted amongst the Jews who are praying to God.
He makes the tent so the others can pray. Yes, he saw the merit in that. And
yeah,
so he has a connection. May not be the best, but it's something.
But the Rebbe never says it may not be the best.
Okay, that was me.
But see what the Rebbe is doing, though, is the Rebbe continues to highlight the amazing part of those good things. There's the guy who breaks all the rules of Yom Kippur, but he shows up. And for an hour or two, the Rebbe says, let's look at that hour or two. Let's just look at that. We're acknowledging the other stuff as well, but look here, he shows up. Isn't that amazing? And the impact of the time that he spends, we don't even know where that's going to go. What generations that could affect, whether it's him himself or someone else. There's a sailor that I interviewed who comes to classes regularly, who puts on tefillin every day, who has mezuzahs. In his childhood, there was none of that, except he tells a story that his grandpa took him to shul 6 or 7 times. And he remembers that. 40 years later, he's now keeps Shabbos, puts on tefillin and davens every day, has mezuzahs, keeps kosher. The years in between, no. But look what started from Zaidi taking him to shul 60 years ago.
Interesting.
So the Rebbe is focusing on the positive things and the fact that we don't know the power of those positive influences and where they're going to go, right?
Yeah, the first memories I have of being in a synagogue are with my great grandmother, Bubby, and we went to an Orthodox shul, and I sat in the mechitza. Didn't even know what that was at the time, and watched. It seemed like from a distance the service. All the men were on the main floor. We were like up in the balcony. Interesting.
And yeah,
it's an impression on me though.
Major impressions, right? Really, really good impressions. That's a good thing. And we don't know what's gonna tip the scale, right? So like then the story, he shares a story here from the Gemara about two comedians. And these two comedians are mentioned in the Talmud that they brought joy to people's lives and received they were joyous and brought joy to others, and therefore they merited the world to come. It wasn't about Torah. It wasn't about mitzvahs. It was that they brought joy to others, and in that they merited the world to come. And when does the Rebbe bring up this Gemara? The Rebbe brings this Gemara up shortly after an Israeli comedian who used to make fun of religious people. And the Rebbe brings up this schus, this merit of somebody who brought joy and happiness. Doesn't talk about the other stuff, the negative stuff, the negative things the guy did. No, he brought joy and happiness, and he proves it from the Gemara that in and of itself is already worth receiving the world to come. And the beauty of this, a deeper part of the beauty of this, is when the Rebbe brings up sources, Talmudic sources and things to show, he's really saying this is the Weltanschauung. This is the world perspective we're supposed to have. The real Jewish perspective on things is to see the positive. There's a story coming up, and what is it called when you spoil it? Spoilers alert, right?
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler. I'm not going to share the story, but there's a story coming up where the Rebbe goes back to a Gemara, and it says, you've been reading it wrong. Let's look at this again. This story is not about the terrible things this person did. This story is about the amazing things this person did. He relearns the Gemara completely opposite. Finding the schus. So, that's a beautiful thing. And to do so against the tide. And this is the example where the story here about in 1976, the raid on Entebbe, right? And so the religious world of that time was very critical, because some people were talking about, the miracles that happened, but how could miracles come about through non-religious or even sacrilegious people? And there's all this criticism, and the Rebbe came out very clearly at a Farbrengen. He said he applauded. It was a Farbrengen in August 16th in 1976. The Rebbe applauded the courage and the selflessness of the IDF soldiers, quote, who flew thousands of miles, putting their lives in danger for the sole purpose of possibly saving the lives of 100.
Yeah, they did pretty well. They lost the commander. That was the prime minister of Israel's brother.
Yeah. Netanyahu.
Yonatan
Netanyahu. But the Rebbe was bringing out in a time when there was a lot of critical, comment, and the Rebbe was very clear. This is a miracle. This is a miracle that was brought out by IDF soldiers. And he doesn't mention the fact that they're not religious or irreligious, or this is a Jews who went out to possibly help other Jews, and miracles came about through them in their merit. And the Rebbe then even says, and their portion of the world to come is guaranteed. They were meiser nefesh. They risked their lives to save other Jews. They're guaranteed the world to come. And the Rebbe got a lot of flack from the religious world at the time. But again, the Rebbe set a standard of Limud Zechus, of seeking merits, advocating for acceptance and love. And then I think the chapter comes to end with that story of the kapos, the Rebbe's ability to turn around and look at those people, those Jews in Nazi Germany who took advantage of an opportunity to take care of themselves over other Jews, and were considered the lowest of the low. And yet, like you mentioned, that the Rebbe brings out how could you expect anything else. Every human being. And he brings example from the Talmud of kings and Kohanim, who every person is expected to do the best they can for themselves. If a person goes beyond that and is meiser nefesh, puts themselves at risk to help someone else, that's an amazing quality. But that's not the norm, and that's not to be expected. That's above and beyond. And for that, we have to laud them. So again, the Rebbe, someone was focusing on the negative. The Rebbe said, what else could you want?
Interesting side note as a soldier about the king, what do you call it? Being happy about leap years for 13 months because he would basically get a free month's labor off of his soldiers because they are paid their salary per year. Side note, I got a little chuckle on it.
Right. And the Kohen who could be worried about changing the leap year because it could end up making it colder temperature for him on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur.
Yeah, right. Because he has to take the what do you call it?
And he does all of his avodah in bare feet.
Yeah.
So, but that's the norm. The norm is the human nature is we look at it for our own advantage. To someone to go beyond that, to be looking to putting oneself aside for the advantage of others, that's heroic. That's nothing short of heroic.
Yeah, I like this chapter. It was thought provoking.
Absolutely. Zev and Benji. Hey Benji, any ideas on thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah. Let's get the
there's multiple ways to look at it. I guess still go back to Pirkei Avot. Zehu Mechubad. Who is honored? He who honors others. And you're always going to look for the good in people, to honor them above yourself.
Yeah.
Many historical examples of people who were unselfish. There are many examples in Jewish history of people who were very selfish. The Kohanim in the Second Temple, who bought their positions through bribery.
Yeah.
In the first temple, you had 410 years in the first temple, and there were a grand total of 12 Kohen Gadols. In the second temple, 420 years, there were over 300, because these people bribed their way into the position. The king could appoint the Kohen Gadol, and whether they thought they were going to do good for people in that position, is unclear. But that's not a good situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we gravitate. I think of my middle son in Marine Corps boot camp. So at the end of each day, there was about right before lights out, there was a 5 or 10 minute prayer period, and the up and coming Marines, I forget the proper term for them during their that period. I don't know if they're called boots or poolies or whatever the name is.
Boots or trainees.
Trainees.
Army term. The
trainees at that time would gather together in their own little religious groups and have a couple of minutes to pray together or something. Most of those sessions turned into belly aching sessions, complaining sessions. They would complain to each other. My son and his battle buddy Mendel, they the only Jews there, so they kind of, what do we do, and so they started sharing successes for the day. What did you feel good about today? And focused on positive things, and their group started growing, not because other people realized they were Jewish or anything else, but the fact that here was a group that was talking about the positive things of the day. And before they went to sleep, they reflected on the positive things for the day. And that group just continued to grow. So it attracts others. It's a very to be very positive attracts others to you because they want a piece of that. They want to have what you got. I want what he's drinking, man.